Good day and thank you for joining CivilNet. Today our guest at the studios is Laurence Broers, Associate Fellow at the Chatham House, Russia and Eurasia, the Editor-in-Chief of the Caucasus Survey Journal in London, and also a Fellow at the School of Oriental and African Studies. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for the invitation.
And my first question is that your expertise is centered on unresolved conflict, peace resolutions in the South Caucasus, Armenian politics, Azerbaijani politics. So all of this brings me naturally to the Nagorno-Karabakh issue. And in light of the recent developments in Nagorno-Karabakh, what's your expert evaluation of what happened?
Well, first of all, I would say that it was not something that was unexpected. This is something that a lot of people have been predicting. Specifically over the last 2 years, we've seen numerous incidents, so it didn't come out of the blue. I think it's in some senses related to other destabilizing background factors, the long-term depreciation of the oil price, some domestic unrest in Azerbaijan, although that shouldn't be overestimated. The Russo-Turkish dispute, I think, is not a cause, but is a background factor. And then the timing of this escalation coinciding with the departure of both presidents from the Nuclear Security Summit in Washington. And the nature of the escalation itself. I mean, I know that this term 4-day war has become kind of popularly accepted, but I really see it as an escalation that perhaps to some extent tipped out of control over these 4 days. And I think what actually happened during these 4 days shows that it was not really an attempt to remake the map. There was no strategic kind of follow-up to the initial taking of these different Armenian posts in different areas. So that really, for me, underscores a political function to what happened, and I see it really as an attempt to reconfigure the dynamics around the peace process, and to send a message, I think, that this peace process is dysfunctional and needs reshaping.
Is this reshaping happening? Is the peace process becoming functional once again? Because like Azerbaijan was very vocal about the OSCE Minsk group being not, functional enough or helpful enough or active enough. Armenia wasn't, and following this 4-day war, has the peace process gained any momentum?
Well, what we've seen since the ceasefire on the 5th of April is, first of all, a flurry of Russian-led shuttle diplomacy in the immediate aftermath. I think Russia was very quick to seize the initiative there. But what's interesting is that it was really at the meeting in Vienna later on that we actually see some sort of concrete declaratory commitments to all the things that the parties have been asking for, basically. So, we have mention of an expansion of the mandate of the personal representative, discussion of the institution of an OSCE-led investigation mechanism, which meets sort of the Armenian priorities on security, together with mention of a comprehensive negotiations process that needs to begin. Plus, I think another important, not to be underestimated, commitment to exchange of information on missing persons. Now, whether these very promising declarations are actually followed up is the key issue. And my sense is that, when we look at concentrated moments, episodic multilateral interest, things happen. You get the 3 foreign ministers of the co-chair countries, you get the commitments. But the danger is that the news cycle moves on, international attention, so many other crises, including in this neighborhood, that whether that momentum can be maintained is really doubtful. And I would add that you look at the climate within the societies involved, and the nature of the peace process itself, it's become an extremely narrow top-down process. It lacks the institutional capacity to really engage in a comprehensive negotiations process. So, I think that for me is the big crisis in this peace process, is the lack of institutional capacity.
Well, the possibility of having monitoring mechanisms along the borderline was supposedly agreed on in Vienna. Is this something in conflicts such as Karabakh, the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, do you think such a mechanism can yield results or actually be installed?
Well, as you know, in September of last year, the OSCE Minsk Group co-chairs actually called for such a mechanism and indicated that Armenia had agreed in principle to discuss the modalities of such an instrument, whereas Azerbaijan had declared a lack of willingness to do that. We have the commitment in Vienna, but we also have a number of contradictory statements coming out after that meeting where senior Azerbaijani policymakers have said, you know, we don't necessarily agree to this. And the consistent line, I think, coming from Baku has been that we can agree to such a mechanism provided that it is tied to the deoccupation of certain regions. And that implies a new line of contact. Now, where would this line of contact lie is a very big issue that goes to the heart of
the conflict itself.
The conflict of how we imagine and think about the Madrid principles, the sequencing of these principles. So I really see a lot of obstacles from the vantage point of today. But if Azerbaijan saw tangible movements towards what it wants to see, which is, you know, a results-focused peace process, you know, things can happen quickly. If there is that decision made, I wouldn't exclude the possibility. But you know, for them, I think the issue is not to see this security infrastructure further entrenching, further embedding what is for them, as you know, a front line of occupying forces.
And maybe you're one of the few people who's been in Armenia and Azerbaijan and allowed access. And what's the general public opinion in Armenia regarding the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict and in Azerbaijan? More or less the same, any differences?
Well, speaking from the perspective of today, there's obviously been a huge rally around the flag effect, and it's very difficult to kind of penetrate that and to see what the real sentiments are. I think that the Karabakh issue is absolutely central to the nation-building efforts on both sides. Territory is absolutely central to how Armenians and Azerbaijanis think of their nationhood, think of their identity. But I want to draw attention to the last polls that were conducted in both countries by the Caucasus Research Councils, which indicated that although Armenians and Azerbaijanis have diametrically opposed visions of the eventual status of Nagorno-Karabakh, more people in both states indicated more confidence in a negotiated outcome than in a solution through war. So that, for me, is an implicit societal demand for statesmanship, and what we see is the reverse of that, unfortunately. So I think, you know, the Karabakh issue is very divisive, very different visions of what an eventual solution might look like. But I think that there is a belief that is very muted, it is implicit, and it is obscured by much more vocal, high-volume nationalism. There is a belief that a negotiated outcome is possible between these two peoples.
And with conflicts such as Nagorno-Karabakh, well, it can go on indefinitely, be the status quo or the situation as it's now. What is the general, like, if you compare it to other conflicts within the region, what is the general time when it just a negotiated resolution is not stops being a possibility, if it drags on?
Well, I think a negotiated outcome is always going to be a possibility. I don't think there comes a point where negotiation becomes impossible. I guess the parameters and the agenda of negotiation changes. So, you know, when we look at the conflicts in Georgia, for instance, we see a very different dynamic in the Geneva process. So, as I understand it, I mean, in a sense, the status issue has been de facto decided, at least for the immediate future. Russia has recognized these two de facto jurisdictions as independent states. It has signed its own kind of association agreements with them that have dissolved a lot of boundaries. And what we see is that the Geneva process, in a sense, has been, in a very limited way, revalidated as a forum for Abkhazians in particular who are less happy about this coerced integration to interact with the outside world. And my understanding is that the Geneva process is focused on small, practical, pragmatic areas of cooperation with very limited goals. And it's the exact opposite of the Minsk process, where the status issue is very undefined, and there is no cooperation, not even on the smallest practical issues. So I think even from the perspective of Tbilisi, what happened in 2008 was a catastrophe. But there is still an agenda, still that process in Geneva still provides an interface with populations in Abkhazia in particular.
And now we're always opposing concept of territorial integrity with the concept of, I'm calling them concepts because I'm not really sure where it stands as principles or human rights. I hear a lot of other opinions, different opinions about this. Territorial integrity as opposed to people's right to self-determination. And in today's situation, people are hoping that one or the other will weigh the other out. What is it your opinion that's which is gaining momentum?
Well, a diplomat will always tell you that these two principles form part of a bigger package. Neither one can be isolated and put into a hierarchical relationship with the other. They form part of a set of principles in the Helsinki Final Act, and although the parties assert the primacy of one or the other, that is a kind of a false hierarchy that is not substantiated by the law in which we find these principles. The other issue is that different territorial conflicts have been resolved in different ways. I think that the ethos of self-determination was extremely popular and dominant in the 90s. The Soviet Union collapsed. That collapse was increasingly interpreted as a post-colonial, an imperial collapse. And what happens when empires collapse? Nations self-determine. But I think what we've seen is that self-determination is not necessarily a solution. You look at other contexts. Take South Sudan, for instance. You've had a self-determination, but that hasn't ended the conflict. In fact, since South Sudan became independent, we see a very serious civil conflict in the country. So I think the international thinking is very much on what is the strength of the institutions in a given territory that wants to self-determine. Because particularly in a contested conflict like the Armenian and Azerbaijani conflict, I mean, you can come up with claim and counterclaim. What is the strength of the institutions on each side to provide for the rights of populations? Self-determination in itself is not an answer, and it doesn't have the same rhetorical force as it had in the 90s. And itself, it is also, I think, evolving. We hear more and more about remedial self-determination, which is a different concept entirely. So my brief answer after all that would be that in the end, the resolution of these two principles has to come through in politics, in institutions, and this is what we don't see in the Armenian-Azerbaijani context.
Well, Nagorno-Karabakh, the self-proclaimed Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh, I think within the last 20 years has more than proven that it is a republic. It is functional. It is functional as itself, as a republic. And do you think the public opinion about Nagorno-Karabakh should have changed within this 20 years? Seeing the results of the elections, parliamentary decisions, and the whole infrastructure already in place in Nagorno-Karabakh.
You mean their opinion about self-determination?
Yes.
Well, obviously, since 1991, I mean, there has been the consolidation of a de facto jurisdiction, what we call in academia a de facto state. In some senses, that's misleading. Just in the sense that state formation is not always the original intention. And certainly in this case, unification was the original intention. And I think the institutions and the rhetoric of de facto statehood is a kind of a defense, an answer to international disapproval of irredentism and to minimize that irredentist content in this conflict. Now, I think a lot of care has been taken to present a democratic face to the outside world. There have been regular elections, de facto presidential elections. There have been changeovers, presidents observed their term limits and so on. But at the same time, I think it is a particular kind of democracy that emerges in these de facto jurisdictions. There is a lot of emphasis on security. The capacity for a genuine diversity to appear in society is quite limited. I think there is some interesting research on the extent to which rival presidential candidates are genuine candidates, or whether they are, a kind of an image of pluralism. And then there is the issue of...
Well, we have that in Armenia and we have that in Azerbaijan, so...
Yeah, so that is, yes, I mean, that is an issue that covers the region. And of course, I know that one of the answers to that question is that it's exactly the same in Azerbaijan and Armenia. These also saw mass displacements. But I think, if you're trying to set up a new state, you have more responsibility. Then the international state system benefits already existing states, it benefits larger entities. So I think that's a kind of a difficult area when we think about...
Well, let me ask the same question from another perspective. Azerbaijan's outspoken hatred of Armenians in general, which extends well beyond the Nagorno-Karabakh population, and it's really out there and official. Does that not take away from its claim to territorial integrity? Because if they take over Nagorno-Karabakh, they are going to have to take it with the Armenian population.
Well, I do think that one of the most worrying aspects of the situation that we're in today is that there's no real concept for cohabitation on neither side. President Ilham Aliyev has committed to this highest level of autonomy, but there's no white paper, there's no document that we can look at and see what rights is Baku willing to devolve to Nagorno-Karabakh, and what would this look like? There is a tendency in Azerbaijan to stress that there are Armenians living in the republic, but I would like to cite the figures of expert Arif Yunusov. He estimated the number of Armenians to be around 3,000 in Baku, and these are mainly wives in mixed marriages, so there is no kind of existing community. And I think it's a pity, and it undermines Azerbaijan's claims that there is no such concept for cohabitation on the table.
With my conversations with Nagorno-Karabakh officials, when I asked about the question of return of refugees and if they are ready to accept Azerbaijani citizens returning to Nagorno-Karabakh, the answer was yes, but proportionally. The same amount should be expected from Armenia to return. Do you think this is a concept that could work as a
I think that concept still makes a lot of assumptions about numbers, and I think this is a key concern on the Armenian side, is that there would be involuntary returns, and therefore we have to control the numbers that, in a hypothetical situation, of returnees coming back to the territories. And I think that line of argument simply underscores the need for political reforms, for democratization, for returnees really to be able to exercise a choice, not to necessarily feel obliged. The right of return is a right to choose. It's not an obligation to return. And I think if we were looking at situations where we could be confident that displaced communities and their descendants would have that right to choose, I think a lot of the fears and insecurities around this issue would be taken out.
Right. Thank you very much. And I hope to speak to you again upon your return to Yerevan one of these days. And thank you to the viewers for being with SiViLNet.